Hey guys, it's Chris from Highland Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In the last episode, I talked about my 5 favorite hand tools, and I'll put a link to that episode if you want to go back and watch that. And I also promised that I would talk about my 5 favorite power tools for building guitars. Well, as it turns out, as I was planning and filming this episode, I realized I really don't have 5 favorite power tools. I've got 15 of them. So rather than edit it down to my 5 top favorites, I decided I'm going to talk about all 15 of the tools, the power tools that I like to use when I build guitars. So sit back, relax, and watch as I explain which of the 15 power tools I use the most. And we're going to start out at number 15, which is the least important of those tools, and then we'll finish at number 1, which is the most important tool that I use in my shop. So let's get started. Okay, so slotting in at number 15 on my list of favorite power tools is my pickup winder. Now, I realize this isn't like a woodworking power tool, but it is powered by electricity, and it is a tool that I use to wind my pickups. Without it, I'd have a real hard time making my own pickups. And I like to make my own pickups because it allows me to control the tone of the instrument that I'm building. Sort of the same as when an acoustic guitar builder selects the wood for their guitars and then carves and shapes them in order to shape the tone of the instrument they're building. I figure if I'm going to go to the trouble to build an electric guitar, I want to go ahead and make the pickups myself so that I've got control over the tone overall for the instrument. And the pickup winder that I use is something I built myself. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics about how I made this. It would make for too long of a video. And besides, I've already done a video on that, and if you want to check it out, here's a link up here. But this pickup winder is pretty simple, and if you don't want to make your own pickup winder, the folks at StewMac sell one. I believe Mojo Tone sells a pickup winder, and there's probably others out there. You might be able to find them on eBay as well. But I think the ones that you can buy from StewMac and Mojo Tone, you can also get them disassembled and then put them together yourself to save yourself a little bit of money. So otherwise, you don't need a pickup winder if you're going to purchase pickups off the shelf. And if that's what you're going to do, then this isn't a tool that you'd need. And that's why it starts out the list at number 15. Okay, so next on my list at number 14 is an air compressor. I use this air compressor for a variety of different tasks, from blowing dust off of guitar bodies and necks as I'm sanding them, to running a few air-powered tools that I use in my shop. And one of those tools is an HVLP gun. And this is just a small, it's basically a touch-up gun. And when I need to spray color on a guitar, I like to use this gun. And it works really well with this compressor. You don't need a big giant compressor to power one of these things. In fact, when it comes to guitar building, if you're going to be using spray equipment and you want to use a compressor to power it rather than using like a self-contained HVLP spray system, you really don't need to get a giant compressor. As long as the CFM ratings of the compressor are enough to power the spray gun that you're going to use, you should be fine. Having a 10-gallon capacity is enough to allow you to spray a clear coat finish on a guitar body or a guitar neck. Because, you know, a lot of times folks will say, oh, you need to have like a 60 or an 80-gallon compressor. But usually what they're talking about is when you're spraying clear coats on a car body. So guitars are much smaller, so you really don't need to have that kind of capacity. I mean, sure, it's nice to have an 80-gallon compressor, but look at the price of an 80-gallon compared to a 10-gallon. And I think that this is probably what you're going to end up picking if you're building guitars with it. At number 13 on my list is a drum sander. Now, a drum sander isn't critically important for guitar building, and that's why I put it at number 13. However, once you have one, you're going to love it. And drum sanders first became a tool of choice among acoustic guitar builders because acoustic guitar builders have to thickness really thin pieces of wood that are used in the top, back, and sides of their acoustic guitar bodies. And unfortunately, you can't really do that sort of work with a straight blade planer because they typically can't thickness wood down to what an acoustic guitar builder needs. And that being said, it's still an important tool to use if you're building solid body acoustic guitars, especially if you're going to be working with exotic figured woods like flamed maple, quilted maple, and that sort of thing, because those types of wood, when you try to run them through a straight blade planer, you can tear out chunks of the surface, and very quickly you can ruin an expensive piece of wood. But with a drum sander, you can flatten out that surface without the risk of tearing out chunks of wood, and that's really important. So because I use a lot of figured wood in my guitars, a drum sander is an important addition to my shop. And this is a tool that I built myself, and I chose to build one myself because commercially made ones can be pretty expensive. Now, I'm not going to get into how I built this. However, if you watch the video I have linked up above, you can check out a little bit more detail about how I made this machine. And you'll notice it has about an 18-inch wide drum, which is what I would recommend if you're going to do a drum sander in your shop. And this one in particular, I added a feature of a 10-inch wide disc on the side here, so it's really two tools in one. So that's my drum sander at number 13. All right, at number 12 on my list is a buffing machine. And a buffing machine, it's not a critical tool, once again, unless you're planning on doing a lot of guitars that will feature a mirror-like high gloss shine. Having a buffing machine will greatly reduce the amount of work you need to do to achieve a mirror-like high gloss shine. Plus, it's going to do it a lot faster. And one of the problems that you'll encounter as you're trying to achieve a mirror-like high gloss shine is all the level sanding and polish sanding that you have to do before you even begin the process of buffing. The amount that you do is going to depend on the technique you use to buff. And using a buffing machine, especially one that has at least a 1 horsepower motor and 14-inch diameter buffing wheels, is going to greatly simplify and reduce the amount of work that you need to do to level sand and polish sand. Typically, if you're going to be buffing by hand, you're going to have to work through a whole range of grits in order to reach the point where you can start to buff. And that takes a tremendous amount of work, a great deal of time, and it always increases the risk of sand through. But if you've got a buffing machine like this, you can reduce the amount of work necessary to level sand and polish sand, and you may only have to use 2 or 3 grits before you can go to the buffing machine. And then when you buff, the time it takes to reach that mirror-like high gloss shine is dramatically less than what it would take if you were trying to do it by hand or with one of those foam pads, you know, on a car polisher or a random orbital sander as other folks do. Having a buffing machine is just going to mean a far higher quality of finish in far shorter time with far less work. At number 11 on my list is a belt sander, and this is a 4x36-inch benchtop belt sander, and I bought this, gosh, 15 to 20 years ago. And I can't even count the number of different types of tasks that I use this machine for. Anytime you've got to quickly sand a surface of a small piece of wood, this is the machine you're going to go to. And it's just really quick and easy to use. But what I'm really using it a lot for these days is I use it to rough shape my bone nut blanks for my guitars, and having the ability to quickly sand those to a rough shape is important, and I can do it so quickly with this machine. And this one has an 80 grit belt, and then it's also got this small 6-inch disc which features a 40 grit disc, so I can very quickly remove wood with it. And I would typically use this for initial rough carving of any, or rough shaping of any piece of wood before I go on to final shaping. But this thing is definitely a time saver. And as far as the size is concerned, they do make even bigger ones, like a 6x48, and I think they go even bigger than that. But when you start looking beyond the 4x36, what you're looking at is a floor standing model, and it's kind of nice having this as a bench top so I can roll it around, and it doesn't take up a lot of space, and I've never felt the need to have anything larger. At number 10 on my list of power tools is an oscillating spindle sander. And what these tools are great for is sanding the curved edges of your guitar body. They can also be used for shaping a neck. And they come usually with different size sanding drums, and you can fit them with different grits, usually ranging from 80 grit to 150 and then up to like 240. That's what this machine works with. So I can start out with an 80 grit, rapidly shape the edges of the guitar body or the neck. Then I can switch to 150 and then finish with 240, and I have a pretty smooth surface. And it does it very, very rapidly, much faster than you can do by hand. And the real value of having an oscillating spindle sander is not only is the drum spinning around, but it's also moving up and down, hence the term oscillation. And what that does is it prevents you from burning the wood as you're sanding it. And anytime you're using a drum spinning at a high speed, you run the risk of the sanding grit burning your wood, and that can be a real problem because the burn can actually go deep enough into the wood that in order to remove it, you have to remove quite a bit of wood. So having an oscillating spindle sander is a reasonably priced way to rapidly shape and finish the sides of your guitar bodies, as well as to do some shaping with the neck. And you can also put a fence on the plate and move it up close to the drum, and it will serve as sort of a miniature thickness sander. So there's some flexibility with regards to this tool. At number 9 on the list is a classic. It's the Dremel. A Dremel is the sort of tool that has just a multitude of different uses. In fact, you'll find if you own one, you're always coming up with new ways to use this tool. So it's a good idea to have a Dremel in your shop. And in fact, you see, I've got 3 of them. And the reason for that is every time I stop by my local thrift shop like Goodwill or Arc, I'll always check and see if there's a Dremel for sale. And usually there is. And I've picked up all these. I don't think I've ever paid more than $10 for a Dremel. And what I recommend is a variable speed Dremel. That way you can control the speed for whatever task that you're working on. And when you own a Dremel, you're going to end up over time collecting bits, and you can probably start out by buying a variety pack of different kinds of bits for your Dremel. You'll also probably want to look into getting one of these. This is a StewMac router base, and I can attach my Dremel to the base, and it works great as sort of a mini router for doing detailed inlay work. And another accessory that I found useful is a flex shaft. With the flex shaft, obviously you can get into tighter places with it. And I've even made some of my own attachments. And some of you might remember the fret tang nipper that I came up with a long time ago, actually. And if you're kind of curious about what this is, I'll see if I can find the video, and I'll post a link up here so you can check it out. But yeah, that's number 9 on the list. a Dremel. All right, now at number 8 on the list is an HVLP spray station. If you're looking to do a mirror-like high gloss finish on your guitars, nothing beats spraying the finish. And you can brush it on, you can even wipe them on, or you can even use rattle cans. But having a good quality HVLP system is going to allow you to spray your clear coats so that they lay down a lot smoother. And when they lay down smooth, they're so much easier to level sand, polish sand, and buff up to a high gloss finish. So having an HVLP system is really the way to go. Now there are a lot of them out on the market, and what I've noticed is they can range widely in price, and the price is usually driven by how many turbines are in the turbine unit. And the more turbines you have, the more expensive it gets. However, the more turbines you have, the smoother your finishes that you lay down. So this one in particular, I think, is either 2 or 3 stages. I can't remember which, but I've seen some of the higher end models running upwards of 4 to 6 stages, and those do a really great job, but they come at a price. So at number 8, an HVLP spray system. Okay, now we're up to number 7 on the list, and that is a soldering iron. If you're building electric guitars, you're going to be soldering electronics, and at the very least, what I recommend is a simple 25-watt soldering iron. With one of these, you can do most of the tasks involved in wiring your guitars. Now, I know a lot of people are intimidated by the whole process of soldering, but it really isn't that difficult. It just takes a little bit of practice, and once you get the hang of it, you can solder in your sleep. It's also important to remember that the circuitry in electric guitar is among the most basic and simple circuits that you'll ever encounter, so it's really not that difficult to solder up the wiring. And there may be situations when you're building a guitar where you would want a more powerful soldering iron, and this is a 40 watt. For example, if you're going to be installing a nickel silver cover on a humbucker, soldering that cover to the base plate requires a bit more heat than you can get from a 25 watt. In fact, trying to do it with a 25 watt is just going to lead to some frustration. So you also might want to consider a 40 watt. Now, if you just want to get one soldering iron that does it all, I would recommend one of these digitally controlled soldering irons. With this one, I can vary the temperature just by adjusting up or down, and I can set it for whatever task that I'm currently working on. So I can go from a cooler soldering temperature all the way up to the hottest. And a soldering iron like this will cost a lot more than just your individual 25 and 40 watt, but it's well worth it. And you should also consider whatever soldering iron that you buy, you need to be able to purchase replacement tips for the soldering iron, because they will need to be replaced periodically. And you don't want to buy some weird off-brand soldering iron that you can't get tips for. So I like to use, both these are Weller, and tips are readily available at just about any hardware store. So that's number 7 on the list, a soldering iron. Okay, next on the list is a joiner. And a joiner is a tool that I use for one very specific task, and that is to true the edges of boards that I'm going to glue together. So, for example, if I'm going to be making a body blank, I typically make my body blanks out of 2 boards which are glued together along a center line. And I want that edge to be as straight and true as possible. And that's what I use the joiner for. Now, of course, you can also join an edge with a hand plane, but a joiner works so much faster and requires less wear and tear on your shoulders, neck, and elbows. And I also use the joiner if I'm going to be gluing together a book match top. Of course, I'll run those gluing edges over the joiner. And then sometimes I'll use it to plane a surface of a scarf joint on a guitar neck that's going to have an angled headstock. So there are a number of different uses for this, although they are fairly specialized. And I've been using this same benchtop 6-inch joiner for well over a decade, and I've never found any reason to want to use a larger joiner, because you can get these in much bigger models. In fact, you can go up into like the 8 to 10 inch model, but when you start talking about those larger joiners, you're talking about a floor standing model that's stationary. And with this one, I can just set it on my bench and wheel it around the shop to wherever I want to use it. So here we are. I think this is at number 6. Okay, coming in at number 5 on the list is a planer. And I've got a 13-inch capacity straight blade planer. And I've had this thing for years. I bought it off of Craigslist for like 150 bucks. And I've got to say, it's the best 150 bucks I've ever spent, because I use this thing all the time. But like the joiner, its use is somewhat specialized. The only thing I really use it for is to thickness the boards that I'm going to be using to make my body blanks, my neck blanks, and my fretboards. So I'll run them through this to get the surfaces really flat. Now, I know some of you are going to be wondering which one should you get? Should you get a planer or a drum sander or both? Because I have both. And the reason for that is because with a straight blade planer, you have to be really careful about the kind of wood that you run through it. If you run figured wood like flame maple or quilted maple through it, there's a good chance, because it's a straight blade planer, that you're going to tear out chunks of wood. For that reason, I use a drum sander to do final thicknessing on any kind of highly figured wood. But everything else that I use, the alder, the plain maple, the mahogany, whatever else, babinga, whatever, rosewood, I'll run it through this machine to get it to its final thickness and to flatten the surface. So that is the main purpose of using a planer. And if you are so inclined and money's no option, instead of getting a straight blade planer, you could also look at a helical cutter head planer. However, planers with helical cutter heads are easily going to double the price of your planer. So that's just something to consider. But this is number 5, a planer. Okay, coming in at number 4 on the list is a random orbital sander. And a random orbital sander is going to do a lot to make sanding so much easier. They are a real lifesaver, or should I say a neck, shoulders, elbows, and back saver. We do so much sanding building guitars that having a tool like this can really simplify the process and actually make it somewhat enjoyable, if that's even possible. But what I use is a 5-inch diameter, 8-hole random orbital sander, and there's a bunch of them out there on the market, but I do encourage you to invest in a better quality sander. And you might even want to consider a variable speed, although I'd use just a single speed and it's worked fine for me. You're also going to want to invest in good quality abrasive sanding discs. With a poor quality sanding disc, the abrasives can come off, and that can result in those unsightly little curly-Q sanding scratches. We also call them pigtail scratches. You also want to learn how to use the sander properly, and that means not moving it too fast. And you're also going to want to have good dust extraction, because when dust builds up on the surface of the sanding grits, you're going to once again have those issues with those curly-Q scratches. But if you use good quality abrasives, good dust extraction, move the sander at a fairly slow speed over the surface, you can get a fantastic surface finish with far less work than if you were to try and do it by hand. And when you get the sander, a lot of times they come with these little dust bags on the back. First thing you want to do is get rid of it. And instead, you're going to want to have a vacuum hose that you can attach one end to your shop vac and then the other end to your random orbital sander. And that way you'll get the best possible dust extraction, which is going to improve the quality of your sanding when you're using a random orbital sander. Okay, slotting in at number 3 on the list is a drill press, and a drill press is extremely important. You can try drilling holes with an electric hand drill, but the chances of getting those holes straight are pretty slim. If you want perfectly straight holes that reflect good craftsmanship, you're going to need to invest in a drill press. And I've had this one for close to 20 years now, and it is a 12-inch, it's a good old Delta 12-inch benchtop drill press. And this is about as small as I would recommend going for guitar building. If you can afford to go bigger, great, go bigger. But a 12-inch is going to be perfectly suitable for just about any kind of drilling operation that you need to do when building a guitar. And of course, I'm talking about drilling holes for tuners, bridge mounts, string through holes, control mounts, pretty much any hole that you're going to drill on your guitar is going to benefit from using a drill press. And as you can see, this one has a shop-made table, and that's only because the original table that it came with broke many, many years ago. And I replaced it with just a simple shop-made wood table. But I also have it's a pin guide, and I can set this on the table and attach it. It's attached with wing nuts, but it has a pin in the center, and that lines up perfectly with the center of my drill bit. And that's perfect for drilling those string through holes that we like to use on guitars. And as far as bits are concerned, I would recommend picking up a set of brad point bits in 64ths, going from the smallest bit, 64th of an inch bit, all the way up to a 1/2 inch bit, and then consider a set of Forstner bits, which will allow you to drill much larger diameter holes. So at number 3 is a drill press. Okay guys, we're getting close. We're at number 2, and that is a bandsaw. When I first started building guitars, to cut out my bodies and necks, I was actually using a jigsaw. And the problem with the jigsaw is, in order to cut through hardwood that's as thick as what we typically use, you run the risk when using a jigsaw of the blade bending as you're making your cut, especially in curves. So I learned right away that if I was going to cut accurately, I was going to need to have a bandsaw. And what I recommend for your shop, if you're looking at buying a bandsaw, is to get a 14-inch bandsaw. You can go larger, of course, it means you're going to spend more money, but a 14-inch bandsaw is going to work just perfectly for almost every cut that I can think of that you would do with a bandsaw when building guitars. And having 14 inches gives you that clearance that you need between the blade and the back structure so that you can turn the guitar bodies, and that amount of clearance is plenty adequate. Another thing you want to consider is resaw capacity, because if you're going to invest in a bandsaw, you ought to have the resaw capacity that's going to allow you to book match your own tops, because that's what's going to really save you money. When you buy wood that has already been book matched for you, you're going to look at spending, anywhere from $90 to, a couple $100 for a 5/8 book matched top. But if you have resaw capacity like this, you can buy your own board and resaw it yourself. And that's going to save you a great deal of money. So you want to make sure that it has that resaw capacity. And most of the 14-inch bandsaws that are on the market today seem to have that kind of capacity. But if you get a good deal on a bandsaw that maybe doesn't have enough capacity, and we're talking, you want at least 8 inches here. And if you find a bandsaw that has maybe 6 inches of capacity, what you want to do is see if you can get a resaw kit for that particular bandsaw. That's what I did with this one. I bought a kit that included this spacer, a longer blade cover, and the hardware to bolt it all together so that I can increase it from a 6-inch capacity up to whatever this is. This is probably about 8 or 9 inches. And actually, it'll go much further if I move this blade guide up all the way to the top. Now most of your bandsaws will have ball bearing blade guides, and I used to have ball bearing blade guides with this machine, but I ended up switching it to cool blocks, which I found personally to be easier to set up, and they gave me better results when I was resawing my book match tops. So that's what I have at number 2. It is a 14-inch bandsaw. Okay guys, we are finally at tool number 1. I wonder what that's going to be. Actually, it's going to be 2 tools. Both are different. However, they do the exact same thing. They just do it a little bit differently. And of course, I'm talking about a router and my CNC machine. Now, obviously, the router is controlled by your eyes, your brain, and your hands. The CNC machine is controlled by a computer. So let's start with the router. The router that I use is a variable speed Makita router, and it's a full-size router. I recommend that you get a router which you can use bits with a 1/4-inch shaft and bits with a 1/2-inch shaft. And I also recommend that you get a router which will use a plunge base as well as a fixed base. And what I've done here is I've attached the fixed base to this sheet of MDF with a pair of cleats on either side. And what I can do is I can clamp this into a workbench, one of those portable workbenches, like a workmate. And then I can attach my router up through the bottom, through the fixed base, and presto, I have a router table, and for virtually no money invested. So typically when you buy a router, you can purchase them as a kit, and it comes with that fixed base as well as the plunge base. And the plunge base is what you're going to use when you route neck pockets, pickup pockets, control cavities, that sort of thing. So you've got to have the plunge base for those operations. And I recommend that you invest in a decent quality router. There are a lot of cheap ones on the market, but the cheap ones, I think you'll find they have issues with their accuracy in terms of run out at where the bit is. And you can have issues with brushes burning out midway through a route, and that can always be such a pain. But you will find that of all the tools that you have in your shop, a good router is absolutely critical. And all the different operations that you can perform with your router make it such an important tool to have in the shop. So this is the one that you should consider investing in first before you get anything else. And then that leads me to the CNC machine. Now the CNC machine does basically the same thing that the router does. However, it's being controlled by a computer. So all of the cutting operations that you perform with this, they're exactly the same as what you do with a router. But you have to create files to begin with, 3-dimensional files, and from those you create G-code, and then that G-code is sent by your computer into a controller, which then guides the router as it cuts. And I started using a CNC machine about 5 years ago, and I started out with the X-Carve from Inventables. And I have to say, if you're only planning to build 1 guitar, 2 guitars, or just do it occasionally, you know, maybe at the most, say 3 guitars a month, the X-Carve is the way to go. It's going to do everything you need a CNC machine to do, and it's an affordable package that includes everything you need to do that sort of work. But if you're going to be building more guitars than that and want increased capacity, greater speed, much more rigidity, you might want to consider something a little more heavy duty. And of course, the CNC machine that I use, as I've mentioned before, in other videos, and I'll post a link here if you want to see how I put this thing together. But I designed and built this one myself, and it features all the capabilities that I needed in a CNC machine. However, before you pull the trigger on either an X-Carve or building your own CNC machine, what I would recommend doing is exploring the software that you need to use to run these machines before you do anything. And I know with the X-Carve you can use their easel software, which is free. And it's not a true 3D solution, it's more of a 2.5D. But if you want to get into true 3D carving, like you see when you watch YouTube videos of guitars being made on a CNC machine, you're going to have to learn how to use that software. And it is not necessarily the easiest software to use. And the good news is you can download demos of that software and try it out yourself and see if you can find a program that fits your way of doing things, that feels comfortable for you to use. Because the last thing I would like to see is for you to go out and spend the money necessary to buy one of these machines only to find you just can't master the software, or it's just beyond what you thought. That can lead to a tremendous amount of frustration. So download the software, try it out, get a feel for it, and then you can decide whether you want to go this route or this route. Whew. Well, there you have it. Those are my top 15 favorite power tools. And I think I pretty well covered everything. The one power item I don't really consider a tool that I didn't really mention in this is dust collection. You know, if you're using power tools, I highly recommend that you invest in a good dust collection system. And I have a turbine dust collector, and I also have a ceiling mounted dust extractor in my shop. And I would highly recommend at least that, or a good shop vac that you can attach to all your tools as you're using them. Because with all these different power tools in your shop, you're going to be generating a lot of dust. And you want to try to get a handle of that. Otherwise, you're going to be living in a world of dust. But I hope you found this episode to be informative. And if so, you know, please click that thumbs up button. If you have any comments or questions, post those down below. I do my best to try to answer those. And then if you don't already subscribe, please do hit that subscribe button. And then next to it, you'll see the little bell icon. Click that. And then anytime I post a new video, which is about once a week, you'll be notified of when that happens, so you can catch up and see what different adventures are occurring in the Highline Guitars guitar building studio or shop, or whatever you want to call it. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great weekend, a great week ahead, and we'll see you soon.